Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for being here today. I appreciate your time and dedication into wanting to learn something new. Today, we're going to be talking about Hispanic Heritage Month, myths and realities of substance use disorder. And this is by myself, Program Coordinator Ruth Del Pino. I always start my presentations with a couple of things, just as baseline disclaimers and baseline knowledge. First thing, hello, my name is Ruth Del Pino. I am a program and prevention educator at the Mercer Council on Alcoholism and Drug Addiction. I'm Mercer County Grant Program Coordinator. I have a Bachelor of Arts in Global Studies, Political Science, and American Studies. I'm certified to teach English as a foreign language, life skills training, and leadership. So that's a little bit about me. So first thing, why this presentation? If you are reading some of these statistics and you are frightened by what you see, understand that this is not to scare you. This is to inform you. This is also not a parenting class. You are the best parent for your child. You know them the best. You've probably known them longer than they've known themselves. Another thing I would like to add is this is also a presentation for any person that works with children in any capacity, whether it's a caregiver, a babysitter, a teacher, an educator of some sort. It doesn't matter, as long as you work with children, you're more than welcome here. Or if not, if you want to learn something new, thank you for being here either way. Also, understand my perspective is shaped by my approach and my learning experiences. So when we sort of are talking about this as a prevention educator and as someone who is working on programs as I do, we sort of come across a lot of information and resources that give us sort of the buy-in knowledge that we must have when we're working on programs. So a lot of these programs, a lot of the evidence that we look at is very useful. So I use that stuff. I use all of those resources, all of those lenses, and all those approaches, and I integrate them into my learning experiences and then put them back out in these presentations. Also understand this is evidence-informed and some evidence-based, meaning I look at the interwebs and all the studies that are done on the interwebs and anything in between. I look at the viable resources, I look at the empirical evidence, and I integrate them into the presentation so that we can look through that. Also understand that because when I say evidence-based, it is based on the empirical evidence and evidence-based programs that we have at the Mercer Council, such as Too Good for Drugs, Footprints, Parents Who Host, and things like that. So if you see any rhetoric that sort of comes around, the rhetoric is based around the empirical evidence on these evidence-based programs. So here we go. Another last thing that I'm going to be talking about is we are having disclaimers today because this is something that for some people is a really emotional topic. So I just want to set some ground rules before we move forward into this presentation. First thing, this is meant to inform on the populations I am bringing to light. So if we're talking about Hispanic populations, we're talking about Native American populations, all those sorts of things. We are talking about one specific population today, meaning that that doesn't mean that other populations aren't important, that there are other populations that face other things that can truly affect the way that they function on an everyday basis. It's just that we are highlighting one specific experience today. Also, I do not speak for this population as I'm just trying to present information. I will try to be as observant and as objective as possible with the information that I bring forward. There is a mention of hate crimes and violence, as well as some sexual abuse mentioned in this presentation, just because it is relevant to the topic. So if you are uncomfortable with that, there will be a timestamp if you are viewing this on the YouTube channel to skip ahead for those certain parts. Also, this is not a debate on any political matter. When we are talking about evidence-based resources, we are talking about how we can help the community because we are a public institution serving the public. This is highlighting the struggles and nuanced barriers faced by a specific community. Also, respectful discourse is welcomed and completely encouraged. If you have anything you would like to add, anything that you have questions about, anything that you are concerned about or would like to learn more about to understand holistically what's going on, then you are more than welcome to engage in that process with me or anyone in the chat box or the comments below. So first thing is we sort of have set a baseline for Hispanics in New Jersey. First thing, being Hispanic and being certain things is a different process here. So Hispanic and Latin are actually two different terms. And when we hear about this, we may hear Latin American versus Hispanic American. And the reason why there are so many terms is actually because the history of Hispanics or Spanish speaking populations or Latin populations in the United States is really complex. We can say this because those who first spoke Spanish touched upon Native American land in 1513. So that means we have been surrounded by a lot of Spanish-speaking populations for hundreds of years. So this is happening upon the time that the solely native land was part of this process. So understanding that there was a lot of colonization that happened, there was a lot of history that it some parts is shameful and some parts is interesting. So for us to understand that, we must use that moving forward. So a lot of the time when you have different populations that are speaking a certain language of a European country or of any other countries, such as English, Spanish, Chinese, things like that, those countries most likely have been colonized by a higher or a superpower or a super monarch or things like that. So when we're sort of looking at this, there were a lot of identities that had sort of had to shift through in the context of Spanish-speaking populations and Latin populations in general. And the reason why we use Hispanic is to specifically say Hispanic means Spanish-speaking populations. Now, when we talk about Latin populations, we are talking about populations that can be Spanish-speaking populations and holistically are, but also talking about any population that in sort of encompasses the Latin community. So this could be Portuguese speaking people, this can be Brazilians, this could be anyone from Central South America or any islands where Spanish speaking populations or Spain or Portugal had sort of made their way through. And we also want to recognize that there are many different terms when it comes to the Latin population as well. There is something called Latinx, and this is specifically meant for gender inclusion, so that when people say Latinx populations, they are saying anybody that may not identify with Latina or Latinos, or sort of wants to fight against some of those gender norms that exist in those societies. They use Latinx to sort of encompass the inclusion of people that I don't identify with either or want to fight that gender norm. So also understand that if you are looking for more information on how words do matter with people and how they interact with their environment, I have a presentation that I had done in June called Words Matter, and words, how do they affect youth or something along those lines. And it is right here. So if you ever want to go to that presentation, it's right there. So I have given you some history lesson on this, but I also want to say that 50% of the Hispanics that exist in the United States right now are actually derived or from, or their place of origin is from Mexico. And Mexico, meaning that it's not necessarily they came from Mexico to the United States. It's that before the United States became the 50 states that it had, it was that they had resided in different parts that Mexico had owned on that land. So that includes Texas, Arizona, parts of New Mexico, things like that, California, so, and Florida. So all of that we must understand too, is that in that time frame, Mexicans actually were technically residents of the United States because they were not on United States land, but they lived there. So there are a lot of populations, especially in Texas, Arizona, and New Mexico, that actually derived from Mexico that were either forced to become American citizens or forced to move away and become Mexican citizens. So there was definitely a couple of wars that had gone through and a couple of conflicts that had made that happen, and the migration of the Hispanic population move. Also, the percentage of people who are Hispanic in the United States, it obviously varies, but let's sort of look at this for a second. There are quite a few different voter populations here. The Hispanic population is also the fastest growing population in the United States. And we're sort of going to be looking through that a little bit, but let's get into New Jersey because we specifically want to focus on New Jersey. So the population in New Jersey is the 7th largest in the nation. So that means there are only 6 other states above us that have more Hispanic population percentage-wise than we do. About 1.7 million Hispanics reside in New Jersey, which is 3.1% of all Hispanics in the United States. So that's a pretty good chunk. Also, New Jersey's population is 19% Hispanic, the 8th largest Hispanic statewide population shared nationally. And there are 831,000 Hispanic eligible voters in New Jersey. And it goes to break down some of the eligibility and how many actually do vote. But essentially, some 48% of Hispanics in New Jersey are eligible to vote, ranking New Jersey 22nd nationwide in the share of Hispanic population that is eligible to vote. By contrast, 78% of New Jersey's white population is eligible to vote. Now, we're going to be talking about first generation just for a second. But before we get into that, I do want to look at Pew Research because a lot of people look at Hispanic populations, and because there's such a complicated history, there may be some weird classifications that people are looking at here. So in the population, Hispanic population reached nearly 61 million in 2019. So that's a pretty big chunk right here. And there's immigration stuff here. There's also people who identify as Hispanic and do not identify as Hispanic. So as we can see here, we're sort of going to be talking about this. And people who identify as Hispanic or have Hispanic ancestry, the farther you get away from that ancestry, the less likely people are to identify as that ancestry. So you can see here foreign born people who were born in the United States or not born in the United States that immigrate to the United States. 97% of people that come from Spanish speaking countries identify as Hispanic. Then you get second generation, which is the generation that's born here. And then you have third generation, which is the generation after, and so forth and so on. So the more out you go, the less Hispanic people tend to identify and become. Also, we also need to know that there is a history of Hispanic, Latino, and Spanish origin, meaning that there are so many different ways that the Census Bureau actually collects information on that. So this actually is one of the questions that were in the 2020 census. So that is something to keep in mind. All right, now moving forward, we sort of want to talk about first generation just for a minute, because while we are looking through this, we need to understand the identity of youth that we are working with so that we understand the societal norms and practices that happen with it. So first generation children are identified as people who are the first born in the United States after their parents have immigrated. So this means that if you had parents that moved to the United States and had a child that was very young or born in the United States at that time, they are first generation in that country of the United States. So if anyone, for example, immigrates from Guatemala, has a baby before they reach the United States, becomes a citizen in the United States, and that child grows up, that is technically still first generation because they were accumulated and acculturated by the United States culture. So first generation in general, 43% of first generation Latino children, 21% of those in the second generation, and 5% in the third generation or higher are not fluent in English. So that's something to keep in mind. 47% of first generation Latino children have parents who have less than a high school education. And the more you go up, such as second generation, third generation, that number only decreases. 34% of first generation children live in poverty, while 26% of those in second generation and 24% of those in the third generation or higher. 69% of first generation Latino children lived in married couple families compared with 73%, and that gets higher as people move on. Also, if you have any questions about this study or any statistics, I know I'm throwing a lot of numbers at you, but it is to understand the context of New Jersey and how we can sort of provide resources based on the number and populations that exist in this state. So we also want to talk about culture for a second, because there is no other way that we can really understand Spanish-speaking populations without understanding culture first, because without it, there is no context for providing resources. There is no context for the approach in which we can gently provide resources. So there is a saying that I don't know if anyone who is of Hispanic descent or knows any Hispanic people, but you may hear a phrase a lot that is mantenerlo en la familia, meaning, and you can sort of look at it in a lot of different ways, but anyone that's taken Spanish 1 or anything like that understands that this means keep it in the family or maintain it in the family. Now, what does this mean? This can mean a lot of different things, but we can understand that the more you go out from first generation on, the less likely mantenerlo en la familia is actually implemented. So when we sort of have this, we need to understand that we can sort of obtain it to keep it in the family. Nobody else needs to know. The family can take care of this, right? So when we are looking at this, there are many parts to what that actually means, But for today's purposes, we can sort of say saving face, also appearing okay, keeping up with the Robinsons, something like that, where you want to appear as if you are as put together as possible. And this actually becomes something that is so much more in the United States, because people who have immigration status, or people who are immigrants, actually look to appear as put together as possible, so that there is no reasonable suspicion for anything, just because they feel that they need to survive in an environment that may be hostile towards their existence. Now, there are other parts to Hispanic culture that I did want to touch upon, and this is why we need to understand this, because this can attribute to a lot of mental health disorders, a lot of substance use disorders. So there's something called machismo. And I don't know if anybody has sort of heard this sort of in, the background of any sort of conversations, but machismo essentially is that it sort of is something we can attune to something like toxic masculinity in the United States, but it is a little bit less like that, in that it is a strong sense of masculine pride or an exaggerated sense of masculinity. And when we have that exaggerated sense of masculinity, there are a lot of people that play into that. So obviously, the population is made up of men and women and people who identify in between. So machismo does play that role, especially in his Spanish-speaking countries, where there is a binary of gender. So if you are not a man, then you are a woman. So if you identify with machismo, then you sort of act and play into that part. And because machismo sort of has connotations to it, unhealthy can mean controlling, dominating, with aggression, expecting women to be subservient, expecting them to serve others and serve them. The healthy parts of machismo could also be honor, dignity, providing resources, providing for their families. And that can also have some implications as well. But this is to understand that machismo is something that carries over into first generation populations and so on and so forth when you are socializing Hispanic populations in general. When you talk to a lot of Spanish speaking populations, you can see machismo in the way that they interact with one another. And this doesn't mean that it's bad. This doesn't mean that it's wrong, but it is something to keep in mind as people move forward. There is also something that you may hear around. I know on TikTok, even people that don't speak Spanish, you may see hashtags for chisme, and chisme or ponchinche also means gossip. What's the tea? What's the thing that's exciting? What's the thing that, is the culture of the group? What's the thing that, she's going to therapy? Those are the sorts of things. It's gossip, right? So a lot of the time, especially in Spanish speaking communities, they have a what would the neighbors think mentality, what do people think of us mentality. So as they sort of have their rigid gender roles, they actually have a very fluid definition of what gossip means. It could really just be telling people what's going on in their lives. It's not necessarily rigid. It's something that is very, amendable to the situation. So chisme, and there was actually there was a socialization study done by Kochman Mavrelis. It was a case study, and it was a company that publishes on diversity content. And they look at gossip, and gossip is actually one of the ways that especially Latinas or women in Spanish-speaking populations communicate with one another, because that's something where they sort of learn everything. They're the ones that I don't know if anybody else can sort of picture this, but if you picture women, what do you picture them doing? A lot of the time, you probably picture them talking to other mothers, talking to other people, because women in general are socialized to be very social creatures. And so when you learn about that, chisme or that tea or that gossip, it is something that perpetuates those friendships and helps people understand what's going on in the family. This is also a way for people to maintain relationships with one another, because it is something that is much more of a practice. We can also see this in a lot of other populations. It's not just Hispanic or Latin populations, but this is something to keep in mind. And it is a culture so much that it even has words that are associated with it. Now, there are good sides to this, obviously, because there's a socialization aspect. There are bad sides because you may feel that people are gossiping about you or that people are talking about you in a negative way. But talking about one another isn't necessarily viewed as something bad. It's just viewed as something as information. And depending on the intent behind it is whether it could be good or bad. So, and that also plays into the idea of maintaining the family. What are people going to talk about? How are we going to maintain this in our family? But also, there's another side to this where if you are talking about it with someone else, you may not be talking about it with a professional, but because they want the chisme, because they want the gossip, they may actually be sharing their troubles with their friends, and those friends can actually look for resources for that population. So that is something to keep in mind with that cultural practice. Now, we are also looking at rates of usage because this is something that, the presentation is about. But I want everyone that's listening to this to picture addiction for a second. Now, when you picture it, what kind of person pops into your head? And if you picture substance use disorder for a second, what kind of person pops into your head? Now, a lot of people may not necessarily know addiction is technically one of the end points to a substance use disorder, and that in substance use disorder, there are many points of intervention in which people can analyze their behavior and understand it. So substance use disorder is much more contingent on who you're doing it with, when, why, how. Addiction is sort of one of the end points of a substance use disorder. So it is when your body is reliant or dependent on a substance. Now, the reason I ask for people to picture this is because if you have any sort of person that comes to mind, one, that may show what you think about addiction, but also may show some of your biases. And that is something that a lot of the time when people talk about addiction or talk about mental health, that is something people try to mitigate when they are providing resources to one another. Now, in New Jersey or nationally, let's just look at this for a second. There are some numbers that I really wanted to look over, and this is through the addictioncenters.org. And obviously, substance use disorder and substance abuse in general is a public health problem in the United States. This is just something to keep in mind. But the rates of substance abuse among Hispanic Americans did not necessarily differ from the overall US population. So on the average, the overall US population is a little bit more like 7% with people who identify as a substance use disorder. Hispanics identify almost right on that mark. So when you have that, that doesn't mean that they are socialized that much differently in that they have substance use disorders, but there are many different factors that play into that reality. One of them is also that there is a gap between Hispanics and the rest of the population when it comes to substance abuse treatment. Studies show that despite being more likely to need substance abuse treatment, Hispanic Americans have less access to substance abuse treatment and must wait longer to access such services. Now, we can identify this in a lot of different ways when we're talking about treatment here. And it is because it is actually an approach very similar to the presentation that I did on Asian American and Pacific Islanders, where I had actually pointed out that AAPI populations actually have less rates of usage in their groups, but they only reach substance use disorder treatments and addiction treatments when they are at the end of a substance use disorder, meaning Hispanic populations tend to keep it in the family, save face, maintain it in that family, and then use that mentality all the way up until it's no longer formidable anymore. So when you have something that is just so unobtainable, so hard to manage, then you reach out for substance use disorder treatment. It can be much harder to actually find resources because you're distracted. There are many different parts to it. People are at their wits' end. There's not a lot of information that they can use because there are so many different areas that they're looking for. So understand that when we are looking at rates of usage here, it may be that the rates of usage are the same, but the ones that seek treatment are the ones on the spectrum of extreme. And that is very similar to the AAPI population. So we're going to keep that in mind. Also, I do want to look at mental health for a second, but before we get on to that, treatment, and the last thing I'm going to say about it is that treatment can be a lot of different things. And the reason why it can be harder for Hispanics to access is because there can be a number of reasons. And we're actually going to be talking about that in the next slide for immigration, because immigration is a part of the Hispanic population. It is not something we can ignore, so we need to talk about it. But there can be disparity of services for a lot of reasons. And it can be language, cultural norms, discrimination. And I actually want to read a statistic here by the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration, SAMHSA. They report that 91% of Hispanic Americans with a substance use disorder are unable to receive the treatment they need at a specialty facility, such as substance abuse rehabilitation centers. And also what they had found that Hispanic Americans, when they are in those treatment centers, have poor outcomes in substance abuse treatment programs. Some of the disparities in treatment occur from increased availability of cultural sensitive treatment programs. So keeping in mind the cultural aspects of a person really does help with their treatment. Also making sure that they're, if there is a language barrier, whether or not they can have services for that. And also whether it's spirituality, gender norms, personal relationships, or religion, that is something that plays a role in their seeking of treatment as well, and their success of that treatment. Now we're going to be talking about mental health for a second, because mental health plays a huge role in substance use disorder. Excuse me for a second while it loads. So these numbers are a little bit older. This was something that was done, I believe, in 2010, but I just want to make sure that we're looking at this. 18.3% of the US population is estimated to be Latino or Hispanic. Of this, over 16% have a mental illness in the past year. That means that's over 10 million people, more than the number of people who live in New York City. So that is something to keep in mind. There are some demographics here and societal issues that we may want to look at. 62% of Latinx and Hispanic people have a Mexican background, followed by 9.5% Puerto Rican, and so on and so forth. It breaks it down by numbers here. By 2060, the number of Latinx Hispanic people in the United States is projected to grow to 119 million, or 28.6% of the population. And this is why it is so important for us to address this population now, because there are so many people that are going to grow up to raise children in this society. And if we don't get them help now, or we don't reach them with this disparity, it may lead to people having problems later on in life, which in turn only contributes to their adverse childhood experiences. There are a lot of immigrants from a lot of Spanish-speaking populations that come to the United States as well. 33% of US immigrants are Latinx, Hispanic, and 79% of people in the United States are citizens. Now, when we say citizens, we want to make it very clear that citizens mean that they are indoctrinated citizens. They have the paperwork, they can vote, they are recognized as citizens. Now, citizens and green card holders and people who have residence or permanent residents are a couple of different things here. So when they say citizens, they mean people that are documented to vote, to have all of the perks of being a citizen in the United States. But that doesn't mean of the 21% that aren't citizens, of that 21%, that doesn't mean they are all undocumented. It just means that they have varying statuses of documentation. So whether it's green cards, permanent residence, or work visas, things like that. Overall, 16% of Latinx and Hispanic people have a bachelor's degree or higher. That is one of the lower ends of higher education. 19% of Latinx Hispanic people in the United States live in poverty. And then you can sort of look at the prevalence of certain things. Treatment issues, we sort of talked about that as well. Access and insurance, 18% of Latinx people in the United States do not have health insurance. In addition, Mental Health Association launched a suite of online mental health screenings, analyzed a sample of 50,000, and found that significant percentages of Latinx Hispanic respondents indicated that they would either self-monitor their mental health or seek guidance from a peer. Now, what they mean by that is that's the mentality of keeping it in the family. That's the mentality of, I don't want anyone to know about this. If doctors know, then this may not be a good thing. So this is something to keep in mind to move forward. And these are the sentiments that exist in this population. So if we are keeping that in mind, we can sort of look at the disparity of treatments in the Hispanic population in general. Once again, if you have any questions or concerns, you can put them in the chat. All right, so we're going to be talking about immigration, and we sort of want to look at this for a second because immigration is something that is part of the Hispanic population. It is part of the process. And as we said before, immigration, a lot of people that come to the United States, a third of them are from Spanish-speaking countries, meaning that that is a good chunk of people that we need to pay attention to. Now, I don't want to necessarily talk too much because we want to get into the video. So they're going to be talking about defining Latino, which is Latin populations, which is basically an encompassing Spanish speaking population. And people talk about sort of existing in the United States as an English speaker, as well as someone who speaks Spanish, or the identities that play with both being Hispanic or American, or being Hispanic and American. All right, here we go.
I identify as a Hispanic American.
Afro-Latina.
Mexican-American.
Chicana.
Mexican.
Afro-Latino.
To my family, I am Puerto Rican. To the country, I am Latina.
Growing up, I felt as though I was too Black to be Latina and too Latina to be Black.
Chicana, I think, identifies more of the political and social values that I hold more than just where my family's from.
I don't feel pressure to be more Latino or American. I'm comfortable with who I am, like culturally.
How can I be Mexican when I'm pressured to be more American? How can I be American when I'm pressured to be more Mexican?
My family growing up wanted me to, stick with my Hispanic roots, but also did not want me to show those roots to the world.
A lot of the times people didn't even know that I was Cuban because I guess I don't look like your typical Cuban.
My mom is Mexican, so I've always grown up with her culture, with her language, while being American doesn't come up as easily.
I've gotten people assume, even other Latinos assume that I'm white or that I'm not Latina or Chicana. It definitely hurts, but at the same time, it's not something that I can control. I think I can do my best to project that identity.
It's hilarious when you walk into a room and they don't think you're Caucasian enough, you're not American enough, you're not Latino enough.
Being Latino isn't as accepted as it should be.
It makes me feel pressured to fit a certain mold here in the United States. But now that I'm older, it's more like, it's what I make of it.
That doesn't stop me from being proud of who I am and where I'm from.
And then ultimately, I think what you settle on is how you view yourself.
We're kind of stripped in a lot of cases of our Spanish tongue and our Spanish heritage and told it's really important that you only speak English.
Because if you're from a Spanish-speaking country and you can't speak Spanish, it's harder for you to connect with the people there.
And not being ashamed when you do speak Spanish, but also not being ashamed if you weren't taught it.
Okay, so Spanish is not my first language because my parents were afraid of me being discriminated against because they were discriminated against, and now they're hurting me because I'm not Latino enough because Spanish is not my first language. But they don't know that I couldn't speak Spanish because my parents were afraid of me getting hurt.
My parents have already done all the work for me. And that's why I feel like I have like a bright future ahead of me because the work's already been done. All I have to do is like harvest what has been put on the ground.
But it's about me and other Afro-Latinos working really hard and continuing to make strides.
I feel like this country has a lot of opportunity for me.
When you have pushed another human being towards the light, towards positivity, towards a voting booth, towards using their power, you are powerful.
People are telling us as Hispanics that we don't belong here. That's kind of motivated us to join together as a Hispanic community and say, we do belong here. And despite what you're saying, I will prove to you why I do belong here.
Okay, there we go. Sometimes it doesn't go to there we go. Maybe that'll exit out. Give me a second, sorry. It's always the YouTube videos that trip me up. So we wanted to look at this because when we are looking at the Hispanic generation that's coming up, the Generation Z that identifies as Hispanic, there were some tidbits of information that we could sort of break apart. One of them was duality, whether or not it's being Latino American, Puerto Rican American, whether it's being, Chicano, whatever. There are many different layers to the identity of the Hispanic diaspora. Another thing is that what does this look like? Being a person or a child of an immigrant can lead to trauma in a lot of different ways. One of them can be due to discrimination. One of them can be due to assumption. One of them could be due to lack of resources and understanding what that looks like. So there are a lot of different layers to what immigration status does to a person. Also, when we are looking at the language, once again, referring back to my words matter presentation, is that a lot of courts will use the term undocumented versus illegal, because undocumented implies a status. It implies a condition. It implies something that exists for that person rather than that person holistically not necessarily being a legal person. Now, obviously, humans not necessarily don't have things that make them legal or illegal. It is the actions that they do that make them legal or illegal. And undocumented implies the action of a person rather than the actual holistic being of a person. This also talked about first generation in the United States. So there was a lot of sentiment dealing with first generation, which we had touched upon before. There was something, Melissa put it in the chat. So the most recent status data is Hispanics at 18.7% versus 2010 at 16.3%. So thank you. The Hispanic population is around 19% now, which is, pretty exciting. That's a growing population, which means that at least we know where we can put our resources. The other thing too is that Hispanics actually have reached a record low of poverty rate with 15.7% compared to Black Americans or the holistic Black diaspora at 18.8%, which is a low percentage compared to previous years. This data was done in 2019. Also, because we are talking about immigration, there is no way to get around the detained children in the United States at the ICE detention centers. There are some sort of implications when it comes to ICE detention centers, but I'm just going to throw numbers out there and make people come to their own conclusions. And we are just going to paint this as something where we are just throwing statistics out there. The Office of Refugee Resettlement. So this is numbers from 2020. So the Department of Homeland Security, Alejandro Mayorkas, had said that the camps, which critics have compared to jails or warehouses, are no place for a child. The number of children being specifically held in these facilities, which were designed for adults, dropped from a record high of 5,767 to 677. The previous highest number of children in custody was 2,600 in June of 2019. The Office of Refugee Resettlement Facilities are better equipped to take care of children, so that's something to keep in mind. Nearly 19,000 children were not accompanied with their legal guardian that entered the U.S. in March of 2020. This figure represents the monthly tally, the largest monthly tally in U.S. history. The previous record of 12,000 migrant children was recorded in May of 2019. In February, around 9,500 children were found crossing the border and were detained by American officials. More than 100,000 people in total were stopped from trying to cross the U.S. in February of 2020. About 170,000 people were stopped in March. Now, these are from really big numbers, right? So we just want to keep this in mind that children, a lot of the time when they come to the United States through the border crossing, they are coming through the Border Patrol and they're going through and asking for asylum. Now, asylum is something that people can ask for based on several different areas of their country. There is the Geneva Convention that people can talk about that the United States has actually signed and been a part of and understood. And what the asylum essentially says is that you can ask for asylum at the border without entering first. So if you go to the border and say, hey, I would like asylum, I don't feel safe in my country, then the ICE detention centers would sort of be the placeholder for that. But the process in itself is much slower and much harsher and much more about human rights violations than it would be about having refugee status. So a lot of these people that are coming from these countries are looking for refugee status when they come to the border through Border Patrol. And they're entering through Border Patrol. So in these camps, and something that I wanted to keep in mind is that there was a study done about detained children in the United States. And we're going to be talking specifically about LGBTQIA immigrants just for a second, because I want to keep this clear that just because you're an immigrant does not mean you are just Hispanic American. You are not just Polish American. You are not just whatever country you came from. You are many parts to your identity. And this in particular talked about one of the parts of a person's identity, which is LGBTQIA LGBTQIA. And this population, immigrants in ICE detention centers, especially transgender immigrants, are 97% more likely, 97 times more likely, and this will be something triggering, so I'm going to put the disclaimer at the bottom. It's 97 times more likely to face sexual abuse than their fellow detainees. In 2014, 0.14, that is less than 1% of people identified as LGBTQIA+, but they accounted for 12% of sexual assault victims in these ICE detention centers. Now, understand that everyone in the United States agrees that the immigration system we have needs to be reevaluated and understood, but we also know that while we are in these detention centers, while we are looking at the numbers, while we are looking at the actions done by officials, we need to understand that human dignity, regardless of immigration status, does need to come to the forefront for people to address their mental health disorders, their substance use disorders, and their overall well-being. And it is to say that regardless of what we think the immigration process should look like, this is not the immigration process that is most conducive to providing and fostering relationships for people that are trying to enter the United States. Once again, if you have any numbers or would like to say anything, you can put it in the chat. And it's always the videos that get me. All right, here we go. So I also want to address the elephant in the room. And the reason why we're talking about this is because when we are talking about violence against populations, it does count as an adverse childhood experience, which leads to mental health disorders, which can lead to substance use disorders. Now, there are a couple of things that I'm talking about here, and what I do want to talk about that may be hard for people to listen to, but this is something to keep in mind. There are many different areas of news that actually report on people speaking Spanish in public and actually being severely assaulted for it or dying from speaking Spanish in public. Also know that there are many different areas to this and many nuances to this, but this is the overall that we're talking about here. So there are a lot of people that are being targeted for just speaking Spanish in public. There have been many different ways that people have been targeted, and a lot of the time they say, speak English, you're in America, and a lot of people are confronted with that reality. So this is just one news article. There's another one here of a mother-daughter who were attacked for speaking Spanish in a public park, just talking to one another. And they were not immigrants. They were just Hispanic heritage people. Also, understand that fighting hate crimes is something that a lot of people need to, look at just to understand it, but also know that hate crimes against Latinos and hate crimes in general have been on the rise since 2007. So there's no doubt that there's definitely a raging national debate around things, but we're going to look at some of these numbers here. According to hate crime statistics published annually by the FBI, anti-Latino hate crimes rose by almost 35% between 2003 and 2006, the latest year for which statistics are available. So this was actually published in 2007. So you can imagine, because there are the growing population of Latino Americans in the United States and Hispanic Americans, that number is only actually getting bigger. There also have been many perpetrators of racist attacks here. Rogue Border Patrol agents took it upon themselves to repel an invader, terrorize a criminal alien, or exterminate a cockroach, and those people have actually, hopefully most of them have been prosecuted, but have actually used their weapons and their power to kill or maim a lot of the people that are crossing the border. These are the hate crime incidents that have happened. Some people have passed away from it, others have not, but these are varying states. So there's Arizona, California, Tennessee, Texas, New York, New Jersey, Georgia, California, New Jersey, Arizona, Texas, Utah, New York, Tennessee, Alabama, Kentucky, Louisiana, New York, California, Maryland, California, Arizona, and it just goes on and on and on. And a lot of these are people that are survive these firsthand accounts, or some of these people are also people that were unfortunately killed in the process of that hate crime. So I don't want to throw any more statistics out there just because it is something that can be triggering for some people, but I do want to keep that in mind. Also, I am once again putting a disclaimer for people that are watching this on the YouTube channel to skip ahead to different parts so that you don't necessarily have to listen to the rest of this. But I do need to talk about the El Paso shooting because it is something that was very significant and impacted the Hispanic American community. And it was something that was very hard for a lot of Hispanic Americans to process and did add to the mental health of populations in 2019. So the El Paso shooting was a mass shooting that happened in El Paso. He shot and killed 23 people and injured 23 others. The FBI actually looked at it as a domestic terrorist attack as well as a hate crime. This person was actually seen as someone who actually looked at the manifesto of people, sort of took his cues from a lot of anti-hate groups, and also said that anyone who speaks Spanish or Spanish-speaking populations are the reason why people are not doing as well in this country. He had said things like cultural and ethnic replacement, Hispanic invasion, migrant invasion, things like that. So that is something to keep in mind. And these people were people. So these are numbers, but understand that 23 people had passed away. And I don't know if I read the number correctly, but 7 of them were children. So we're going to be looking through that. Also, we are looking at hate crimes in general, just in New Jersey, because this is something that is a phenomenon in New Jersey. Nearly 40% of all hate crimes were against Blacks, more than the combined total against whites, Jews, Latinos, and Muslims. So keep that in mind as well. But we're going to be looking through this. For the Hispanic population, 102 were anti-Hispanic or Latino. And these are the towns that had the hate crimes happen. Lawrence Township in Mercer County had 12, Egg Harbor had 14, Princeton had 14, South Brunswick had 18, and you can go on and look through these as well. It breaks it down by a lot of different areas here. If you're looking for more information, you can actually visit bias.njcivilrights.gov if you would like to report anything or want to know more information on that. I apologize for all the heaviness, but this is something to keep in mind because if we have this sentiment that has actually happened in the past 2 years, the sentiment hasn't necessarily changed, and we can actually see it getting stronger. And the level of understanding that needs to come from people to provide resources to people who are struggling needs to be greater. So we're going to be moving on and moving forward. We're going to be actually looking at the concept of duality, and this will be one of the last slides I look at here. But what is it? First of all, understanding duality is having one thing and another existing at the same time. So a lot of first generation people may feel that they need to prove something. So I want to play a clip, and we're just going to go on from there. Here we go.
I straddle 2 worlds, as a white woman and as a Mexican. And what most people don't know about me is that I feel like my truest self when I can speak Spanish. So as a white woman, I have people confide in me their insecurities around diversity or immigration. They'll ask me things like, so how do I approach them without being offensive? I have well-meaning colleagues go through a roster of ethnic-sounding last names trying to pick out diverse students, only to find out that that student isn't actually Hispanic. And as a Mexican, I hear how some Latinos talk about the ignorant white person. Some share their incredible stories of their journeys into the United States with me. And I also witness the discrimination that exists both against the Latino who either doesn't speak English or against those who don't speak Spanish fluently. It is amazing to me that nearly 30 years after being hurt by some of the things people said about my mom, I still have people tell me that anytime they hear someone speaking Spanish, automatically assume they're illegal. Or that one of my students at the university was warned by her own parents that her teachers probably wouldn't expect much from her because she's Mexican. Or that one of my colleagues was overheard saying that the only reason I have the job that I have now is because I was the only Hispanic candidate. I didn't speak English until I was 5. I vividly remember being pulled out of kindergarten to count gummy bears in English. And growing up, people would often ask me if I knew Spanish so well because of my Mexican nanny. Yeah, I always wondered why they wouldn't just assume that she's my mom. It also never occurred to me that my friends' parents weren't also pulling over at the strawberry field on their way home from elementary school and running out of their cars to yell, "Ahí viene la migra! Ahí viene la migra!" The way that my mom used to do to warn the field workers that there was an immigration van around the corner. So your parents didn't do that? Everyone here today has made an assumption about someone. Someone you're meeting for the first time, and most likely someone you already know. We are really good at forming judgments of other people. We jump to conclusions based on how they look, how they sound, by their last name, whether or not they have tattoos or piercings, and certainly by the color of their skin. I'm guilty of it too. I emailed a filmmaker asking if he would consider talking to my students about the provocative content he produces. He has a Hispanic last name, and he's outspoken about being an undocumented immigrant. And I thought it would be a great fit with my bilingual project, given his Latino background. Well, I never heard from him. And then last summer, I got to attend a conference where he was one of the keynotes. And at one point, he mentioned his Filipino background. I sank into my chair because I had just committed the exact same mistake that I warned other people against, and I'm still so embarrassed about that.
Okay, so I wanted to play all of that just because we do make assumptions about certain people in the way that they sound. But there was a lot of different ways that she talked about this, and that she made a lot of poignant points here. And I highly suggest you watching the rest of this TED Talk because it is very good. And she talks about a lot of assumption. And she basically says that being first generation obviously leads a lot of people to wanting to prove something. There is a pressure there. And this affects children in many ways in understanding that they have to make sure that they are the model citizens of the United States in order to prove their existence, in order to prove that they belong here, that their parents belong here. And in some ways, they are the translator for their parents because they may learn English before their parents. And that obviously affects their mental health, which in turn contributes to their adverse childhood experiences. We're going to be moving on and moving forward. And this is the last bit of information that I have to give. I always end my presentation on quotes just because I feel, one, it's necessary for things to round out, but two, there are a lot of different ways that we can look at information, and people just say it better than I can sometimes. So the first quote we have is Antonio Dijerino, which is the president and CEO of the Hispanic Heritage Foundation. And he says, "You are not lucky to be here. The world needs your perspective. They are lucky to have you." And the next one we have here is Dionisia Nava, who is a student at California State University. And I believe she was the valedictorian of her class. And she says, "Get behind other people's successes. Your life was built on other people's dreams, so let's not let them down." Now, there's a level of wanting to be to sort of owe your family something, and there can be a level of guilt that sort of comes with that. But that's also being Hispanic in general, because you always, there are a lot of times that people of color have said that when you enter a room, you carry all of the weight of your family, of all of the people of your color with you, and you want to present them in such a way that no one would have an assumption or discrimination against it. I also want to point out children of any race of any age should not have to fight to be recognized. They should not have to have something to be offered, to be given resources, and they need to be to have inner wealth and inner strength in order to do that. So they should not have to prove that they belong here in order for us to give them resources. They sometimes think that there is a only Spanish speaking world and an English speaking world, and it's really hard to navigate between the two. So understand that there are a lot of different variables to what they go through. And we wanted to see the disparities in the system and help them with it. So especially Antonia's quote, we want to say that they don't have to prove that they belong here, that they just belong here. And because they belong here, as part of a public service, we owe them our resources and our time. So thank you for being here. Thank you for everything. I appreciate your time and dedication into wanting to learn something new. Next week, we will be talking about recovery and how that affects children.